Another day, old subscriber. Appreciate you subscribing. Today, we're going to deal with a very interesting topic. We're going to deal with God and logic. In St. Matthew 22, verse 37, Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." He said to love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. The heart and soul is basically the same as it's the fundamental essence, aspect of who you are. Your high, your enduring self. You know, it's all a part of that non-physical aspect of you, the nitty-gritty of who you are. The mind is very important. It is in philosophy, it's a subject of debate whether it's the brain produce the mind, or the mind and the brain work together in a very intricate and complex way. But it's very important when we worship God, we take our minds play a very fundamental role. But we understand today that the emotion is what is leading people to the today in many things, especially when it comes on to theology and spiritual things. People tend to emote more than to rationalize, to subject things to rational analysis. You know, emotion does accompany rationality, but it must not take, it must not usurp, it must not dominate, it must not be the magistrate. It must be more ministerial. It must be subjective, must be subservient to rationality, and this is one of the biggest problems we find today. You know, too much emotion in many things, all pumped up, but they don't look into things rationally. When we're dealing with how to know, we're talking about epistemology, branch of philosophy, and when you come on to the limit of reasoning. Matter of fact, reason and faith goes together. They are allies, not enemies. They're not hostile enemies. A lot of people pass them off to be that way, but they're not. The Bible tells us that we must worship God with all our heart, with all our soul, all our mind. God is a rational being. And we were created in the image of God, so God endowed us with rationality. And we were created to think, you know, and we also think, and we also think over our thinking. We'd call it metacogitate, metacognition, what they call it. We think our thought and then we think over our thought, you know. It is said that the mind is a blank tablet, what they call tabula rasa. There's nothing in the mind. When we're born, this mind was empty, just a blank tablet. And those who hold to it are called as empiricists. They hold that the mind was born with a blank, contentless mind. And as we grow and experience things through our senses and our senses, or our sense modalities, then you start to put, write on the blank tablets of our mind these different imprint form through our daily experience and a lifelong experience. But that seems to be a difficult position to hold. I'm more for the rationalist position, or the natist position, that their first principle for mind. Our mind, they are what they call a priori categories of our mind. They are fundamental principle of our mind that without them we can't reason, we can't think logical, we can't think any at all. It will be difficult. And these are like, for instance, the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, the law of excluded middle. The law of identity: you are who you are. You're not someone else. You are a man. You're a person. And you can tell yourself, say, I am who I am. I'm not a jackass. I'm not a cow. I'm not a bullfrog. And then the law of excluded middle tell you that either the thing is red or it's blue. Either or. Either or. The law of contradiction is A is not non-A. Without this law, it would be impossible to really articulate any meaningful statement, any meaningful thought. We couldn't think things through things rational. Anything that is contradictory is meaningless and absurd. It conveys no meaning, and it doesn't matter if you put God. I think C.S. Lewis said that it doesn't matter if a thing is contradictory, absurd. If you put God before it, it doesn't make it sensible. It doesn't make it rational. It doesn't make it reasonable. R.C. Sproul says, real contradiction may be resolved in his mind that God is not bound by human rules of logic. Such a view sounds pious, but effectively undermines the entire biblical revelation. If contradiction can be reconciled in the mind of God, then we cannot trust the word of God, for in God's mind, Christ might also be Antichrist. Right? Mystery, yes. Contradiction, no. We must be careful to observe the difference. No contradiction can be reconciled in any mind. In God's mind, your mind, no mind whatsoever cannot be reconciled, because contradiction are foolishness. And so these are the fundamentals, a priori principles of the mind that governs the mind. And help us to make meaningful statement. And so it's important for us to be aware of these fundamental principles of the mind, and rationalists. I'm more of a rationalist than an empiricist. I believe these are fundamental aspects of the mind that without them, we can't. The Bible is a rational book, it's a logical book. And God is a rational being. He's a rational, he's a logical being. But you have within Christendom, there are people that do not see God and logics together. Or logics over in philosophy. God is with religion and Christianity. They're diametrically opposing, but they're not. God is a logical, rational being, and we are image bearer of Him, and so we bear the same rationality. We think logical, and we reason logical, and we reason rationally. All truth, Jonathan Edwards said, all truth is given by a revelation, either general or special, and it must be received by reason. Reason is the God-given means for discovering the truth that God discloses, whether in His world or His word. While God wants to reach the heart with truth, He does not bypass the mind along the way. Even if God revealed any supernatural thing to you, revelation, when angels come and bring a revelation, bring a message, it's rational. It's rational. It's logical. It's not contradictory, right? There is nothing in the mind that was not first in the senses except the mind itself. This is a rationalistic maxim. There's nothing in the mind that was not first in the senses except the mind itself. Without these a priori, independent of experience, without these a priori, that is, this deal with the fundamental. You have a posteriori that deal with the experience, and a priori deal with prior to experience. So, without this a priori dimension to knowledge, nothing could be known. Nothing could be known. Without these first principles, the law of non-contradiction on these things, we couldn't know anything. We couldn't make a meaningful statement, as I said before. The laws of logic does not give content to our mind, but they help us to think rationally. So, whatsoever we observe, whatsoever we read, when we reason together, we listen, and we understand, we can understand what the other person is saying, because the other person is using the same law of non-contradiction, these a priori principle of the mind. They're universal, and every man has them. Every single person, because you were created, all are created in the image of God. Now, you could not, if you believe in the evolutionary theory, then there is no way you could have these things, because natural process, evolutionary method of chance and time, billions, trillions of years, and chemical laws or whatsoever, it could not produce these metaphysical principles. Could never. You know, one of the things that you have to take into consideration, that a lot of time when an evolutionist or those are secularists, those who don't believe in the Christian God and the Christian way of life and principle and Christian philosophy and stuff like that. Even though we talk about Christian rationalism. They tends to borrow a lot from the Christian worldview to make their point, but because they can't make any meaningful statement without borrowing from the Christian worldview, because their worldview cannot account for the things that, you know, they believe. There is no foundation to them, so they have to go sneak over to the Christian worldview and borrow capital, borrow stuff from over there and bring over here. It's just like, for instance, there's when it come on to morality, you know, there's no morality. how can a person say, if you say there's no morality, then how could you make any moral statement? You can only make moral statement if you go over to the Christian worldview and take your believe that there's a God that is a foundation of morals, of morality, laws, and moral principles, because only God can account for these principles. Nothing outside of God could not account for these principles. So evolution has no foundation and have no ground to argue for morality. And if we discuss about something that is awful or painful or evil, then he's borrowing from the Christian worldview. A rationalism is an exclusivist, because either if Christianity is the only true faith, then all of the faith must be false. If one thing is true, it excludes the other, the opposite. There's nothing in the mind that was not first in the senses, except the mind itself. The mind was there all along, with its inherent categories for rational thinking and stuff like that. Reason is a means of determining truth. Mind is given authority over senses and the a priori over the a posteriori. The a posteriori is the empiricism, is experience through the senses. As a matter of fact, we couldn't even do science without the a priori category of thoughts. We reason when we look at the evidence, and we have to use the rational capacity, intellectual capacity to do science. Without this fundamental category, we could not start up new science, whatsoever. There are first principle of knowledge without which no knowledge is possible. Reason arbitrates truth, and truth is objective. For rationalists, the real is rational, and reason is the means of determining what is real. We live in a real world, and we discover truth by reasoning, we discover truth by observing, we discover truth by thinking and thoughtful analysis, and then we draw a conclusion. But there's a limit to reason. There's a limit to reason. There's what they call unlimited rationalism that denies special revelation. Anything good taken to the extremes always pose a problem. Anything good taken to the extreme always pose a problem. So we have to balance it out. So the limits of reason, because we can't know all things. There are certain things that are not contrary to reasoning, but transcend reasoning. That, like, for instance, the divine revelation of the doctrine of the Trinity, the incarnation of Christ. A lot of people think these things are absurd and irrational, but they are not. They're sub-rational, but they are not anti-rational. They are beyond human understanding, but not contrary to human understanding. There's Dr. Geisler explained it so well in his Summa Theologia. You know, it's the magnus opus of all that he taught and stuff like that. There's a passage where we talk about God and logic. I'm gonna read a portion of it. Listen to what he said. If logic is the basis of all thought, it is the basis of all thought about God, theology. Some object that this makes God subject to logic. But God is sovereign and not subject to anything beyond himself. So how can thought about God be subject to logic? In one sense, God is not subject to logic. Rather, our statements about God are subservient to logic. All rational statement must be logical. Since theology purports to make rational statement, theological statements are subject to rules of rational thoughts, as are any other statement. In another sense, God indeed is subject to logic, but not because there is something more ultimate than he. Since logic represents the principles of rational thoughts, and since God is a rational being, God is subject to his own rational nature. God is subject to nothing but himself, his own being. Necessitas naturae. The necessity of his being. God is limited by the necessity of his being. He cannot deny himself because God, by definition, is absolute truth. Right? It's absolute truth. Cannot contradict himself. God is subject to his own rationality. Insofar as logic manifests to reason, it flows from the very nature of God, and God is subject to his own nature. Indeed, he cannot act contrary to it, ethically or logically. That's what I'm saying. He cannot deny himself. For example, it is impossible for God to lie. Likewise, it is also impossible for God to contradict himself. Both violate his basic nature. God is not only subject to his own rational self-consistency, he is also subject to logic, which is derived from it. Logic is not invented by men. Logic was discovered by Aristotle. And Aristotle classified them. He delineated them, but he did not discover them. Logic flows from God, from the being. Logic has no beginning, because logic is a part of who God is. For we could not even begin to think about it or talk about God without the law of non-contradiction. In this sense, logic is prior to God in that we need to use logics before we can even think about God rationally. Logic is prior to God in order of knowing, but God is prior to logic in order of being. Logic is prior to God epistemologically, but God is prior to logic ontologically, because it is grounded in his being. But for us to make statement about God, to know who God is, we make rational statement, logical statement. And the self-revelation of God is rational and logical. To object that this makes God subject to our logic set up a faulty dichotomy. Logic is logic. It is not our logic as opposed to his. Ours is based on his. God's rational nature is the basis of our rational nature. He made it, and the way he made it that way so we could understand something about him. The law of non-contradiction applies to God's thoughts as well as ours. People did not invent it, they discovered it. God is not being subjected to our reason. God is the author of reason, and he created us to be like himself. So the basic principles of reason are not arbitrarily imposed on God, rather they came from God. Second, the basic laws of reason are not opposed to God's revelation. They are an essential part of God's general revelation. Human rationality, which is basic laws, is a manifestation of God's rationality. God is rational and humans are made in his image, so using logic is not opposed to revelation. It is a part of it. Third, even special revelation cannot be known or communicated apart from logic. We would not even be able to distinguish the revelation from God from that of the devil unless the law of non-contradiction is valid. Furthermore, when the Bible reveals that God so loved the world, we could not know that love is not hate unless the law of non-contradiction is valid. So logic is essential to special revelation as well as to general revelation. Finally, there's a difference between using reason and being a rationalist. A rationalist trying to determine all truth by human reason. A reasonable Christian merely uses reason to discover truth that God has revealed, either by general revelation or by special revelation in the Bible. So, we are in a very good position when coming to logics on God. Logic is not contrary to God, it's foundational to God. And that's why we have so many anti-intellectualism within the church. You know, church is predominant and governed with too much emotion, not much rationalization. Think about things, analyze things rationally, logically. It's part of who we are. It's part of our image and reflection of who God is. Part of his communicable attribute, you know. So if we have more of this in churches today, you don't have so many people fall for these gimmicks and nonsense you see in the church today, and the things that some foolishness that some of these people talk. And yet we just, the reason why we allow them to pass through the mental analysis, the rational analysis, a gate, is because we are too dominated by emotionalism, and we all get hyped up and say the spirit and stuff like that, and we don't test anything. To test something, you have to test it rationally and logically. You test it with the logicalness and rationality of God's word, truth of God's word. Finitum non capax infinitum. The finite mind cannot comprehend the infinite mind. We understand our epistemological limitation. We will never understand everything about God and many other stuff. There's a limitation to what we can know. No wonder God has to reveal things to us. And so for Christians, faith and reason works well. They help us to understand anything, divine revelation, general revelation. They're allies for truth. the high life is truth. Don't put either one of them down. Don't pit them together. Make them war together and make them inconsistent and like jostling, tug of war. No. So in that way we worship God with our mind. When we dispense with our mind, when we really insult God, when we do not use our mind right, you know, read His word right, believe what is right. It's not everything you put credo before. Think through things before you make them a part of your intellectual repertoire. Think through things thoroughly, meticulously, studiously, rationally, think through, you know, logically. These first principles of mind help us to think rationally. You know, hermeneutics, everything that we do in the entire life, we have to think rationally. We have to use this first principle of our mind. Without them, and nobody can disprove them. Because by disproving them, you're using them to disprove what you're trying to disprove. You know, in you attempting to disprove them, you're proving them. Because you're using the very thing you're disproving. See? You caught on your own philosophical tar, baby. You get stuck. You know? So, I hope this be a help to someone. You know, that we must be rational, because our God is also rational. So take care of yourself. And remember to tell a friend, you know, tell everyone to subscribe, man. And come, let us reason together. God call us, hey, come let us reason together. Bring forth your strong case. Let us argue. Let us, you know, we couldn't be grammar, language, syntax, and all of these things could make no sense without the law of logics, right? We live in a world today that violates all of these. You know, especially the one self-identity, the law of identity. These days, people are thinking of themselves as something else. Other than who they really authentically and genuinely are. So have a nice day. Remember, subscribe. Kyra again. See you next time. Out.